Charles and Harper tied the knot not too long ago, despite their romance spanning 7 years. Both in their early 30s, they were independent and well-established, which was certainly commendable. They entered the bond of matrimony with great care, not recklessly plunging into it. They cohabitated only after making it official with their marital paperwork. Luckily, Harper had inherited an apartment from her grandmother, proving to be a stroke of luck for the young couple. Each partner maintained individual interests and pursuits, proudly claiming their modern outlook, which allowed them to pursue personal paths rather than just follow one another. Their cherished routine involved sharing dinner, catching up on their favorite TV series, and winding down with tea by candlelight in the kitchen. That particular evening, they settled down after their workday, brewing a second pot of tea. "Can you believe it? Samantha is getting divorced," Harper remarked, her gaze fixed on her phone. Charles was taken aback. Samantha and her husband had always appeared to be the perfect pair. "What happened?" he inquired. "It seems Thomas has rekindled an old flame. Apparently, he's been up to no good behind Samantha's back for the past 6 months," Harper shared nonchalantly, as though infidelity were the norm and unworthy of fuss. Charles eyed his wife warily. "Would you forgive me if I cheated?" he challenged. Without looking up from her phone, Harper countered, "Are you planning to cheat?" "No," he retorted decisively. "And I wouldn't forgive you either." "Well, that's unfortunate," Harper responded dryly. Charles chose not to pursue the conversation further. The tone had set him on edge. He simply shrugged and exited the kitchen. Oddly, this trivial exchange haunted him, replaying over in his mind. The thought of infidelity, whether his or hers, had never crossed his mind. While he was certain of his own fidelity, he couldn't decipher Harper's thoughts on the matter, and this uncertainty troubled him deeply. Charles made the decision to confide in his friend about his inner struggles, but instead of understanding, his friend only mocked him. Initially, he felt offended by his friend's lack of support during that difficult moment, but eventually, he began to agree with his friend's perspective. Perhaps he was creating problems out of thin air. After all, Harper's infidelity was never even a consideration. She had merely shared a story from her friend's life, and Charles had extrapolated everything else from it. He started to notice that his wife had developed a sudden fondness for driving their car. Initially, she brushed it off, claiming that she needed a license to collect dust on the shelf. But soon enough, it became a newfound passion for her. Although he secretly chuckled about it behind her back, Charles never said anything to Harper directly. "Hey, who's always riding with you?" he once asked in an irritated tone while they were together in the car. "Can't you clean up after yourself?" he continued. "It's Samantha. She's going through a tough time, and I don't want to scold her for leaving some trash behind." His wife tried to smooth things over. "Well then, throw it away yourself. You're the one taking up the car, so take care of it," Harper said, gently stroking her husband's shoulder in an attempt to calm him down. Charles couldn't help but smile inwardly at the gesture. He loved his wife and couldn't stay angry with her for long. "Forget it. I'll just throw away these coffee cups and sugar wrappers myself," he thought to himself. One day, when Charles returned home from work, he discovered that they had a guest. Samantha, the same woman in the midst of a divorce. Surprisingly, she didn't appear sad or even slightly distressed. Genuine happiness filled Charles's heart for her. It meant that things weren't as dire as he had imagined. Samantha greeted him warmly with an embrace and a friendly slap on the back. They exchanged a few obligatory pleasantries, and the man proceeded to heat up his dinner. Harper was out on the balcony, enjoying a cigarette, so he didn't disturb her. Samantha's eyes flickered with approval as she poured herself a cup of coffee and took a satisfying sip. "Why don't you add some sugar? It must be bitter, right? Allow me to fetch it for you." Charles reached for the sugar bowl. "You," the woman grimaced. "Coffee with sugar is just awful." Charles turned around, his gaze fixing on Samantha with surprise. Wasn't she the one who had left a pile of open sugar packets in the car? Harper had mentioned it. The man decided to approach the topic from a distance and nonchalantly asked a question. "Do you see Harper often?" Samantha shook her head, explaining that she barely had time to see anyone. She was overwhelmed with work, the quarterly report looming, and constantly on the phone with Harper. Charles nodded absent-mindedly and resumed his meal. Thoughts swirled in his mind. Whose were the wrappers and empty coffee cups in the car? Why did his wife claim they belonged to her friend? He had no reason to doubt Samantha's honesty. It was a simple matter with no need for lies. All evening, his mind was consumed by these thoughts, and even throughout the night, he tossed and turned, unable to quiet his mind. Finally, a decision emerged. Charles resolved to purchase a covert listening device and discreetly plant it in the car. He immediately logged onto the internet to select the perfect device. He went to bed somewhat at ease. The awaited day arrived. Charles held the device in his hands. He familiarized himself with the manual, configured the conversation recording feature, and discreetly placed the beacon beneath the car seat. All that remained was to await Harper's departure in the car, accompanied by an unfamiliar man. He didn't have to wait long. A couple of days later, his wife informed him that she would be using the car to attend divorce hearings with Samantha. Charles smirked, attempting to conceal his satisfaction. He knew with a near certainty that no wife in her right mind would take Samantha as her companion. Charles spent the entire day on pins and needles, eagerly anticipating the moment he would access the car, retrieve the tracker, and listen to the recorded content. Upon returning from work, Harper was already home. Charles delivered a well-rehearsed speech about having to meet a friend and hastily left the house. His heart raced as he approached the car. What would he discover? Would this momentary encounter bifurcate his entire existence? For the time being, only speculation loomed. He inserted his earphones into the recording device and pressed the play button. His palms were damp, and Charles trembled from the cold. He had to rewind the tape multiple times until he finally heard the sound of a door slamming and a man's voice. Charles's heart sank into the depths of his feet. Could it be that all of his worst fears were coming true in this very moment? Harper and the stranger engaged in conversation, but Charles's mind was cloudy, and he could barely comprehend their words. He fast-forwarded a bit further. The noise of the car's engine was no longer audible on the tape, but the distinct sounds of creaking and groaning filled the air. It was his wife's moans. Abruptly, the man removed the earphones from his ears. He couldn't catch his breath, as if he had just sprinted 100 meters. He suddenly realized that he was sitting with his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel, fixating his gaze upon something with a crazed expression in his eyes. It was not a pleasant sight. He couldn't delay any longer. Charles came to the decision that he needed to act swiftly, like ripping off a Band-Aid. With the recording device held tightly in his hands, he ascended back up to the apartment. Harper appeared surprised by his sudden return. Charles silently handed her the earphones, and as soon as she put them on, began playing the recording. It was exactly as Charles had described, evident on her pallid face. Harper was not spared forgiveness, and she showed no inclination to seek it. The domicile they once shared, interestingly enough, belonged to his wife, so the man was compelled to depart hastily, leaving with next to nothing. Temporarily, he took up residence with a companion, eventually securing a modest rental room. Through acquaintances in common, he was inevitably privy to the happenings in his former wife's life. She had sold off her residing abode in that vicinity and relocated to another locale, ostensibly in closer proximity to her paramour, Charles concluded. Despite his fervent desire for retribution against this man, it proved futile. Harper's life post-marriage seemed far from the calamitous existence he had envisioned. Over time, he ceased dwelling on this matter and resolved to forge ahead, putting this disagreeable episode firmly behind him.